Hi, I'm Bill Sokol, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, OLLI's presentation, the first in a series of presentations on America's unfinished business. Our presentation this afternoon will be with Dr. Lawrence Rosenthal. We'll be talking about the far right, white supremacists, from the streets to the White House. We'll be spreading out globally. We'll be looking at it historically. We'll probably deal with terms like fascism and populism and nationalism. But before we do that, I want to spend just a moment talking about what we're going to do with the technology. Okay, we're going to use it than we usually do here at OLLI. Number one, we're asking all the videos stay off, okay, so that we don't get video bombed and so that we use all of our bandwidth for the conversation as opposed to video. Number two, to ask questions, rather than doing it orally, what we're going to ask you to do is to type your questions into the chat box. To do that, if you're familiar with Zoom, if you run your cursor across the screen, you'll see at the bottom a box that says chat. Click on chat, and you'll see off to the right-hand side of your screen a line at the bottom where you can type in your questions and comments. As we go through this discussion with Larry Rosenthal, if you'd be good enough to type in your questions as they happen, they'll come directly to me. They will not be shared with the rest of the group because we suspect there may be some trolls here who may want to, bomb us with their hatred and rage. And we just as soon not have to have all of you share that. It'll come to me, and that's fine. I don't mind being their psychiatrist for the afternoon. So if you would simply put your chat comments and questions as they arise, as Larry's talking, just put them in there. And then what we'll do is talk with Larry for about 50 or 55 minutes. We'll then take a 5-minute break. We'll come back and we'll take your questions. We'll leave as much time as possible for that so that it's interactive as possible with you. So that's how we're going to do it today. Let me now do the formal introduction of Dr. Lawrence Hall. He's the chair and lead researcher of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, which he founded in 2009. He's taught at UC Berkeley in the Sociology and Italian Studies Department and was a Fulbright professor in Italy. He studied the right in the United States and Italy. He's currently working on a study of the contemporary American right in comparison to movements of the right in 20th century Europe. He's written several books. He's appeared in many a periodical, and he's the author of a forthcoming book this fall from New Press. And listen to the title because it's very interesting and may give us some direction for where we're going. The title of his new book, Empire of Resentment, Populism's Toxic Embrace of Nationalism. With that by way of introduction, Larry, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Bill. And I thank everyone who's taken the trouble to attend to this. What I'd like to do, just as an opening statement, is talk about the cast of characters. Who is it that we're finding in not only the current, the right-wingers in the current George Floyd protests, but also one of the extraordinary facts of this extraordinary moment is that we have had two movements with people on the streets in large numbers consecutively, boom, one after the other. The first one was the anti-lockdown demonstrations, the people who were fed up with being told they stay indoors and so forth. And then that's followed without any interruption by the George Floyd protests. So about the anti-lockdown protests was that most of the people there were what I think of as right-wing populists. There are those who don't like to use the term populist to deal with right-wingers, but if we go down that road, we'll never find our way back. But the idea here is these are the people. If you can think back to 2009, when suddenly the Tea Party emerged, these are largely the same people. In 2009, the financial crisis had hit and they were feeling economic insecurity. The same thing is true with the coronavirus. The sense of economic insecurity is very deeply felt. And the way they argue about those things is in terms of their notion of freedom, that their rights were being violated. Back in the Tea Party, scholars used to call that point of view populist constitutionalism. And what it meant was that these right-wing populists argued that what the Constitution meant and how law should be understood, it should not be simply in the hands of elites like lawyers and judges, that individuals can make their own determinations about those questions. What happened in the anti-lockdown demonstrations was essentially that populist originalism, as it was called by scholars, populist originalism sort of mutated into populist epidemiology, which was the assertion that these fancy doctors can't tell us what to do. They don't know better than we do. A couple of things about the Tea Party in 2009 that to some extent carried over. One was that at the very beginning of the Tea Party, there were attempts by both white nationalists and extreme gun enthusiasts to kind of take over the Tea Party, or to make the Tea Party, adhere to their particular point of view and their particular issue. And to the Tea Party's immense credit, they kind of resisted that. Things became different with the anti-lockdown, where you got guys who, we'll get to this, who tended to call themselves Boogaloo boys, we'll get to that, who appeared in these rallies. Okay, so we have the Tea Party populists. The next category is, and it's funny because this used to be on everybody's lips and it's not talked about all that much anymore, is the alt-right. I'm sure you all remember the alt-right. The alt-rights is ideologically driven, and their ideology is white nationalism. It's very self-conscious about that, and they are self-consciously in the tradition of both fascist, Ku Klux Klan, and Nazi traditions. As a matter of fact, it was after what was called the Battle of Berkeley in 2017, in April, that the head of, quote unquote, head of the alt-right, who's a guy called Richard Spencer, he declared after that street fighting that things had changed for the alt-right. It was no longer just going to troll people online. Now they were going to fight on the streets. And the way he viewed this was that, as he put it, America, which means that he was making the analogy to pre-Nazi Germany, the Weimar Republic. And the way he characterized it was that you would have a as he called, fragmentation of American politics was going to move to extreme polarization, because you would have the left and the right fighting it out on the streets, as he says, for space and for ideological space. In this sense, as Noam Chomsky recently said, the Antifa is a gift to this point of view. And it's the the position of the alt-right in this is that increasingly people are going to have to choose, and they will choose the right over the left. What's important about this is the extent to which it has been echoed, in effect, by the Trump administration. The Trump administration has given great credence to the idea that the violence was something owing to Antifa, or as Trump called it a couple of years ago, the alt-left. Then it was equivalent. Now it's they're the ones. And this plays very much into the strategy of Richard Spencer and the alt-right. Third category of people are the Boogaloo people. Boogaloo is their word derived from a 1980 song. I don't know a great deal about that, but Boogaloo is essentially about civil war. It's about the time has come for civil war in America. These people are not as, they are distinct, let us say, from the alt-right in that white nationalism isn't their explicit ideology. Their ideology is about guns. These are essentially gun rights activists who have been extreme for many years. And where they have gone with this moment is sometimes called accelerationism, which is the idea that the time has come. The moment is ripe for the Boogaloo, as it's now called, the coming of the American Civil War. An interesting thing and an important point to understand about the Boogaloo boys, as they call themselves, B-O-I-S, is that not only are they gun rights extremists, not only are they talking about civil war, but very fundamental to them is being anti-police. So that the presence of police is a provocation to them as these demonstrations have gone on. And let me draw the analogy here, or the way in which, as with the alt-right point of view, this kind of dovetails a little bit with what we're getting from the Trump administration. At one point, I have a quote here from Trump. He said, I can tell you I have the support of the police, the support of the military, the support of the bikers for Trump. He has conflated constituted authority with gangs, okay? And so this gives legitimacy to the Boogaloo in a way that wasn't available before. He goes on, I have the tough people, but they don't play it tough, unlike the Antifa, as he was saying previously. They go to a certain point and then it would be very bad, very bad. So with that, I would say so much for the dramatis persona, and let's talk to Bill.
Okay, great. Thank you for opening it that way, Larry. You've opened a Pandora's box. Here we go, down and in. The first thing I want to ask you is, A, can you attach numbers to this? Are we talking about a small fringe? And B, have in the George Floyd demonstrations trying to create violence?
Without a doubt, the second point, yes. I mean, there are a number of false flag incidents that have been documented. They're numbers. It's always very hard to talk about the numbers. You know, they are a relatively fringe phenomenon, but they have been mobilized in considerable numbers given their total in this. I don't know anyone who is in a position to attach it's this many people or it's that many people. But they also belong to a tradition of not only gun enthusiasts and extremists, but also this very idea of the Civil War has a long history. For at least 40 years, there has been the kind of right-wing militia fantasy of there would be an event, somebody would do something, and it would spark off a war. It was often thought of as a race war. So, for example, Dylan Roof in South
Let me
Carolina.
stop you right there, Larry. Um, you're raising the issue of race, and I want to focus on that. In view of the George Floyd demonstrations and what's been happening for the last 3 weeks, I noticed that you attached the label of kind of white nationalists to the alt-right, but then you withdrew it when it came to the Boogaloo boys. And I pin you down. How central is white supremacy and deep-seated racism to the far right here in America?
Well, it's fundamental. There's such a history of it, and doesn't go away. The alt-right is devoted to it. The alt-right believes that white Americans are being displaced by others. And those others tend to be dark-skinned, and when they are feeling particularly Nazi, Jews.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there is that side of things, which is firmly racist. What and line is blurry between that and what's going on with the accelerationists, but they are particularly emphasizing gun rights, and some of them are sympathetic to the George Floyd story because it was at the hands of the police.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not entirely clear cut. But in answer to your larger question of the place of race in this, it's fundamental.
And now I want to try to say, as we talk about this fringe movement, obviously something very different has happened with the arrival of Trump in the presidency. And the question is he one of them? Do we now have the far right in control of the White House, if you will, or is he simply using them, I suppose, is the question.
Well, from the point of view of the alt-right, and presumably, I don't know this for a fact, but it's likely from the point of view of the accelerationists, Trump is a vehicle for them. They understand Trump as, certainly from the point of view of the alt-right, not one of them, but someone who had allowed their politics to come into the mainstream.
Well, isn't he inviting them, encouraging them to
Yes.
come into the mainstream? And he wants to use them, which allows me to ask you, for a half century or so, I avoided using the word fascism.
Yes.
I would say to my lefty friends, I'd say, come on, it's not fascism. Fascism, it denigrates what fascism was and how horrible it was. But now it seems to me it may be time to start using that word. And I want to ask you, as a historian of Italian fascism as well as German fascism, can we start to use that term when we talk about Trump and the far right here in the US?
Let me give you a little introduction to that answer, which is I agree with you that the word fascism was used loosely, both on the left and the right. It was on either side the term of choice for dismissing people. Oh, he's just a fascist. It was an epithet. It wasn't an analytical tool, by and large.
Right.
And that has changed. as soon as Donald Trump came down his escalator, you had the most serious discussion of fascism in this country in my lifetime. And it's not just on the left, it was on the right. People like Robert Kagan, who is kind of the eminence grise of neoconservatism, wrote a piece early on in the Trump campaign, which was, "This is America's road to fascism." And you have Madeleine Albright's book, which is Fascism, a warning. So there was a serious discussion of fascism during Trump's campaign. But it wasn't fascism. It wasn't fascism because fascism as a movement required a private militia, which Trump, with all his talking about go knock the crap out of that person at his rallies, or hit his head on the car when you're putting him in, or get rid of that person, all of his summons to violence did not bring about an organized fascist-like militia. And without that, it wasn't fascism.
What do you need in addition to that militia to be considered fascist? What does he have?
Things. There's as it were two red lines. One is militia, and we can come back to that because there's
more. We shall, absolutely.
And the other is what comes about in the German case, in the Nazi case, it was called the enabling law. And what the enabling law did was it allowed Hitler to rule by decree. It essentially neutralized in its entirety the German parliament, and he had come to power in a legitimate way, but it neutralized it. In Italy as well, there was an equivalent called the Acerbo Act of the Enabling Act. So, and the Enabling Act in Germany, it came via, or as a result of the burning of the Reichstag, which was likely a false flag event done by the Nazis themselves. So you have this movement where you have an emergency followed by essentially depriving the legislature of any power anymore.
So Larry,
that's the second line in the sand. Or second, to mix metaphors, that's the second fascist Rubicon to cross.
Okay, so I guess you would argue Trump hasn't yet had the emergence that allows him to declare himself the all-powerful dictator. But with respect to private militia, if we could for a moment, I would have agreed with you relatively recently that, right, he doesn't. But now he has two, it seems to me. Not exactly private, but he has ICE. Mm-hmm. And ICE is now 20 to 30,000 armed brown shirts, literally brown shirts, who report directly to the executive branch. Neither Congress nor the courts have any authority over them. The executive branch unilaterally says in the course of the COVID demonstrations and then the George Floyd demonstrations, he says, we're sending ICE not to deal with the border, but to deal with unrest in Los Angeles and in the South, and we're going to use ICE as our troops. Right. And then the second element I want to throw in for you to discuss, let's do it separately. I want about the police, but actually let's leave that aside. What about the fact that he now has the brown shirt militia called ICE? It would seem like we're one step away. One emergency that gives him authoritarian control. Do we then call it fascism?
I would say that more disturbing than even the place of ICE, or there have been other aides called up, Bureau of Arms and all sorts of
Alcohol,
others.
tobacco, arms, yeah.
And what's more disturbing are the guys they put on the street with no badges and with no affiliation. That is closer to the dedicated militia
Mm-hmm.
than anything we've ever seen. You know, they're haters who refer to them as the little green men, which comes from the description of Russian soldiers in eastern Ukraine while their place there is being denied. Okay, so that's very compelling. That's very close to the line of a private militia or a dedicated militia. You know, when Hitler came to power, his SS was essentially made part of the
Right.
state. In similar way, the organs of the fascist party in Italy became organs of the Italian government under Mussolini. So that there is something quite worrisome with respect the specter, if you will, of fascism about the developments, the recent developments vis-a-vis militias.
Gets scarier and scarier, down and in we go to the rabbit hole. I want to now, we've talked about the alt-right, we've talked about the Trump administration, the relationship there. This is not a talk about police reform and what has to be done about policing. I imagine OLLI will address that with other people. But I do want to ask you, as the George Floyd demonstrations continue, there have been some 10,000 arrests across the country. There have been 130 journalists arrested, rubber bullets being used, people being rounded up when they're peacefully protested so they can be arrested. How do you define the place of police forces with respect to far right, white supremacy, fascism? What do we do with the fact that police are now seem to be not simply bad eggs, you know, or bad apples in the barrel, but there seems to be some kind of real unified action with Trump, of course, meeting with the heads of police forces saying, I'm with you 100%.
It's interesting because in the long-standing, fantasy on the militia right about the Civil War, there would be the spark, and then the quote-unquote patriots would rise up. Mm-hmm. And when they rose up, they would be joined by the police and by the military. And to some extent, the distinction that we're seeing, the difference that we're seeing between the military and the police is the statement by General Mattis the other day, which really took Trump down a peg very seriously about what he was doing with respect to the Constitution. So in terms of the army as a potential for joining in the Civil War or private militia, there is a kind of obstacle at the head of the armed forces, and it's based on a proper understanding of constitutional roles. It's interesting, though, that I think Trump, it's hard to know what is self-conscious because he's largely uneducated and not a person who understands political strategy in anything other than what appears to be, what happens tomorrow kind of.
Or what I see on TV tonight.
Or what I see on TV. But if you take something like, you remember the case of Gallagher, who was tried by a military court for
Mhm.
homicides in Iraq. And Trump intervened during his court martial and afterwards to have, and he had the Secretary of Defense do this, Gallagher's sentence diminished. What hates is that Trump is actually going beyond. He's making a connection that goes around, doesn't end run around the brass of the military, which is not going to support him, and perhaps therefore is developing a conspiracy among right wingers in the service. One, of course, remembers Timothy McVeigh, who was
Mhm.
precisely that, a right winger in the service. With the police, there does not seem to be this kind of constitutional bulwark at the top that would resist the militarization certainly the militarization of police at all, but the place of the police as enforcing um, Trump ideals and Trump's policies. And so that is the kind of worrying end of the long-standing fantasy of what's going to happen.
Got it. Now, Larry, we've gone alt-right. We've talked about the white supremacy. We've gone to the Trump White House. We've now talked about police. We've talked about the military. To go in another direction now, what do you think is the role or the connection or the intertwining or lack of intertwining of the religious right, the evangelical churches that have strongly supported Trump? I think historically, correct me if I'm wrong, neither German fascism nor Italian depended on close relationships with the church.
Right.
And yet here it seems to me that we have this relationship between Trump and the right and the church, or a portion of the church.
That I think you're right about the Mussolini. Mussolini comes to power in a moment when the Catholic Church, and by then, say 1920, for 50 years, had refused to recognize the Italian state, which took away the church's lands during the unification of Italy, 1860 to 1870. But Mussolini did successfully um, come to terms with the church, which none of the liberal parliamentary governments before him were able to. He signed what was called the Concordat in 1929, and the church then recognized the fascist regime, and they were given significant control over education. So there was a connection, but in a way that was more using the how should we say, the organized church
Mhm.
as a political ally. What we're getting today among illiberal nationalist leaders is a great deal more of um, kind of where religion and populism merge as a key bit of support. You get that, for example, in Poland, where the nationalist and illiberal party in power, Kaczynski, his dependency on the church and his alliance with them and his constituency of believers is what keeps him in power. One can look to Modi in India, who is explicitly uh, um, a government of Hindu nationalism.
Mhm.
Um, Putin and his relationship to the Russian Orthodox Church is something similar. Uh, Trump, amazingly, has the support of U.S. evangelicals, the people who arrived on the national scene in the 1960s under the title "the moral majority." It is, of course, this extraordinary irony that this thrice divorced pussy grabber is their guy of choice, and they are the most solid bit of his base.
How do you explain it?
I just as an aside, I don't think that the religious right is a factor in the violence or you know mm, the darkest parts of the demonstrations we've seen, either anti-lockdown or um, or Floyd. Here's why it seems that this has happened. And there's two elements of it. One is uh, uh, Trump was very clearly um, uh, saying to them during his campaign, and has come through since, that he was going to attend to their most compelling issues. There are two most compelling issues. One is gay marriage, getting rid of it, and the second and most important is anti-abortion. Trump did this extraordinary thing during the campaign, which is he published a list of people he was going to put on the Supreme Court,
Mhm.
and they were all selected by the Federalist Society, and plainly, uh, you know, the aim was to bring down Roe v. Wade. Okay, and so you had the judges, and so you have this political side of things, and then how do you square that with this plainly, morally wanting human being? And that's been of particular interest. And the way it's happened is they read Trump back into the Bible. They
Yes. King David.
Trump, either the two main ones are King David and and King Cyrus. King David was, as they say, a murderer and an adulterer, but God said he's good to be the king.
Mhm.
As Jerry Falwell Jr. said, we're not electing a pastor in chief here, and that seems to have taken up. The King Cyrus, which is even more popular on the evangelical right, he was the king who let the Jews out of the Babylonian captivity, as he was the king of the Persians, um, and brought about the Jews being freed, and um, and from that point of view, what Trump represents is God's deliverance of someone who is not of us, but
Mhm.
who
Mhm.
can deliver us.
Got it.
So mm, it seems as though it was inevitable or necessary in order to maintain or to come to terms with this extraordinary bit of cognitive dissonance, that the Bible turned out to be the answer.
Okay. Let me now, having more or less tried to cover the territory, the range of who's part of the far right or connected to the far right in these times. You've studied Italian fascism in particular, as well as German fascism at the greatest length and depth. How close, as you see what's going on here in America now, do you think we are to the German or Italian experience? Or how far from it are we? Are we edging closer and closer, or are we still a long ways away? The cosmic view, if you will.
Okay, a couple of things. One, the Weimar Republic was put together around 1919, 1920. Hitler was elected in 1933, and goodbye Weimar Republic. 14 years of parliamentary democracy. In Italy, you had a parliamentary regime with a king since the Italian unification, and it was rife with problems. So the difference between that and the USA is considerable on the institutional level. The USA, with all the errors, with the being, dishonored in the breach again and again and again, and to the extent to which we're talking to people on the left, these are the things you have been marching about for your adult lives. We know that's the case. But the institutions are much stronger than elsewhere. They were much stronger than Italy, much stronger than Germany. And they're much stronger illiberal regimes, especially in Europe at the moment. Illiberalism is the kind of slow deterioration of democracy. It's retaining voting, but undermining all the things, the foundations of democracy, both in civil society, where people are not in the state, and in the state, packing the courts, making the parliament such that you will always win the vote, and things. And it goes on and on, education and cultural things and museums and so forth. So in the same way that the foundations of democracy have been kind of eroded in places. Let's take the leading place, which is Hungary, under Viktor Orban. Under Viktor Orban, who gives the name illiberalism to the world, and he has arguments for it. This is what democracy is going to look like. This is the only way democratic countries are going to survive, is with illiberal nationalism.
I don't know what that means, Larry. When we slip into that kind of slang, let me stop you for a minute, or that kind of language. I don't know what it means to say the only way that democracy survives is when you have an illiberal regime where you've had an enabling act that lets one man run the country.
Wait. That's the red line, the enabling act. You haven't had that until the emergency. In other words,
which Orban declared and has done, right?
Yes. So Orban has crossed that fascist Rubicon. And he did that by declaring an emergency, and he is now ruling by decree. For the past 10 years or so of his rule, maybe it's a little less than that, but for the past 10 years, it's been salami tactics. But he has finally come up to and crossed that line, that fascist Rubicon. And it's owing to the capacity to declare emergency based on, and he declared lots of emergencies around the refugee crisis a few years ago, but there was no moving to a kind of de facto enabling act.
Do you imagine that that kind of thinking is going on anywhere around Trump? And the reason I frame the
Yes,
question that way
absolutely.
is, is I want to know who the thinkers are. I mean, we thought it was Steve Bannon in the beginning. He seems to be sent off to Europe, to the doghouse. Are there people around Trump who can think this deeply and meaningfully about how do we get from where we are now to wonderful, wonderful fascism?
There is an emerging point of view called conservative nationalism. And they have had events, they have had books. The major theorist is an Israeli called Hazony. And basically what they argue is that the way in which people like you and me might regard American constitutionalism or the things like the Declaration of Independence, the values and the principles upon which American democracy sits. We think it's in the words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's a propositional notion of what American democracy is. They argue otherwise. They argue that it's not what was, not the words, but it was the people who wrote them. It was them as they are defined by, above all, religion, but also other elements of culture. So that is an evolving. It's
What are we
almost,
talking about, Larry?
well, there's this guy Hazone. In California, there is the Claremont Institute, which is kind of the intellectual center of that in the USA.
Mhm.
Among, well-known figures, Tucker Carlson was very well received at these conventions. And
Mhm.
there is, I forget what state, but a senator called, I think it's Joshua Hawley, but Hawley,
Yes, Missouri,
who
I
spoke
believe.
who spoke at this convention, and he is very well regarded uh,
Mhm.
as someone sophisticated in this thinking. And just this thinking has arisen almost as, Trump comes to power, and how do we explain this, or what is Trumpism? It's almost like they're backfilling,
They're
intellect,
creating an ideology for him.
which reverses the way things normally happen, which is you have an ideology and then someone,
Right.
and then you have the avatar of that who
Mhm.
brings it. It's almost like backfilling. Okay, what the hell is this? And that's a labor that is ongoing.
And in the inner circle, um, I mean, where do you place a Bill Barr, a Stephen Miller? Do you see these people as thinkers with ideology and philosophy, or just
But
pragmatic day to day?
Barr comes out of the Federalist Society, and the part of the Federalist Society that argued very fiercely in the George W. Bush administration for what they called the unitary executive, uh,
Yes.
which basically meant that the executive is relatively unbound. The checks and balances that conventional thinking
Mhm.
has around the president were not operative. Both Cheney and Rumsfeld were very strong proponents of this point of view, and it actually had a great deal of impact in the Bush
Mhm.
years.
Mhm.
Um, it's there are theorists of it. There are lots of lawyers who are developing theories around it and so forth. And then you have the vulgar view of it, which is Trump saying, Article 2 of the Constitution, I can do anything I want.
Right. Right.
Words.
And
Uh,
they give him the ideology to support. Listen, I want to go two further places. My time with you is running out, and there are two further things I want to touch on before we open it up to questioning. The first one, um, you've taken us all the way down rabbit hole, dark, 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 dark. What's the way out? You've studied history. How do we get out of this? What's the way out in America We're not even going to talk about Modi and Xi Jinping or Orban anymore or Boris Johnson, but right here in America, as I watch, let me put it this way, as I watch the demonstrations about George Floyd develop, um, I frankly have felt great hope. I felt like people are in the streets resisting in a way we haven't since the 1960s when I was a college kid. I feel like, you know, African American America, you know, Black America is leading the way. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets.
Young people.
How do we get from the mess we're in now to a better America?
Well, you remember the old Phil Oakes song, Love Me, Love Me, Love Me, I'm a Liberal? I don't actually think of myself in those terms, but the plain and obvious way out of it is voting him out. And you know, the circumstances seem propitious for that. You know, there are the current crises, which are financial and 100,000 people who died. So you have these extraordinary crises on the one hand, in which, although if you read the right-wing press, um, uh, Trump's handling of these things is regarded as heroic, which is very difficult to it's you know, you look out the window and you say it's day, and they look out the window and they say it's night. It's a very different understanding of it. And the way I look at the election is, you have the model of 2016 and you have the model of 2018. And in both of those cases, what determined the direction of the election was what the political scientist called Alan Abramowitz calls negative partisanship, which means in 2016, so many people deeply disliked Hillary Clinton that they went for Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
2018, Blue America, who had been, you know, somewhat indifferent to Hillary Clinton, Blue America had had 2 years of Donald Trump and turned out in massive numbers and took back the House of Representatives. And that was also about negative partisanship. There is no reason to believe, in my view, that that dynamic hasn't been maintained or even you know, become more focused in the last 2 years, which suggests that that Blue America is going to turn out and turn Donald Trump out of office. There are a lot of ifs around that. And the ifs are, you know, the person who as a matter of course, projects his own ideas onto others, talks nonstop, again, about, okay, he plainly tried something in the Ukraine, and God knows what else. But one thing which is clear is that in 2016, what the Trump campaign did, above all on Facebook, was absolutely fundamental to their victory. And what basically happened on Facebook is they delivered fake news. Now that's a tricky phrase because Trump picked it up,
Mm-hmm,
and so
mm-hmm.
now have to distinguish in a kind of epistemological soup that between real fake news and fake news. This was real fake news. There were stories like the Pope has come out for Donald Trump, and it was micro-targeted. And this is where things like Cambridge Analytica came in, and you had someone who was orchestrating all of that successfully.
And he's back to do it again, Brad Pascali.
Not only is it back to do it again, he's the campaign manager. He's not the guy sitting in the tech office anymore. He's the guy. So they've pushed all their chips out on what's going to go on online. And what that means is there's a lot of stuff we're not going to see. There's a lot of stuff we're not going to know. So yes, on the basis of the place of negative partisanship, it does look promising that blue America should win, but we don't know what's going on.
Got it.
We don't know what's going on even on Facebook.
Got it. We could go another hour, Larry. I want you to take 2 minutes, one paragraph, okay? Because the title fascinates me. Empire of Resentment, Populism's Toxic Embrace of Nationalism. One paragraph so folks can take a break. What's the book about?
Thank you. It's about how did Donald Trump win the presidency, first win the Republican nomination and then the presidency. It's about America's right-wing populists who had formed this immensely powerful political force called the Tea Party. And they had bought into the ideology of extreme free market, I would call it fundamentalism, the sort of point of view of people like the Koch brothers. We could discuss what that is, but you're giving me a paragraph.
One paragraph.
One paragraph. And what Trump did was he migrated those populists from that ideology to America First ideology.
Got it.
Secondarily, he is part of an international zeitgeist, which I call the Nationalist International. And he also rose up what from the 1930s on, the fringe of American politics, the people who had no place in national politics. They could have a place in local politics. You could get David Duke running for Senate in Louisiana, but the fringe, the white nationalist Ku Klux Klan fringe, was mobilized and they were stunned by it, but they were mobilized. They had never had, none of them in their lifetimes had anything to do with presidential politics. Suddenly, at the level of presidential politics, someone is talking their language. Okay, so they are mobilized, and then finally, Trump in one debate refers to, well, maybe it wasn't the Russians, maybe it was some 400-pound kid on his mother's bed in a bedroom doing these things. He also mobilized kind of the alienated young men who were online and who were essentially nihilistic.
Got it. Okay, one paragraph on the book. If those of you who want to see more of what Larry thinks, it's called Empire of Resentment, Populism's Toxic Embrace of Nationalism, out this fall. What we're going to do now, Larry, is take about a 5-minute break. I'm going to look at the questions in the chat box. People have time. My understanding is that the lines to the bathroom, so you should be able to get in and out quickly. And then we'll come back and I'll start shooting the questions at you in the chat box. Anybody who wants to add a question, please do take these few minutes to add your questions and we'll go to those with Larry. See you in about 4 minutes, Larry.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to mute you, Larry, and I'm going to mute me so we can take the break. Okay, Larry, there are so many questions that if you're willing, I'd like to rock back on in. Can you unmute yourself? You can't unmute yourself. Okay. I'll see if Robert Chu can give me some help in that, or otherwise I'll try. I'm having trouble figuring out uh, where you are.
Okay, I think it's happened.
Okay, super. It has. Good. I'm jumping in early because, man, are there great questions. There's so many of them. We'll take a break for dinner and then maybe we'll have a little schnapps at 11 and go till 2. Here, here, here we. Let me start with this one. What if white supremacy is not unique fringe element, but a core structural fact of the U.S.? And protests about George Floyd are not uniquely about police brutality, but about this structural
I
reality.
think there's no doubt that it's a structural reality. You know, it is. You know, people use the original sin of the U.S. and gone away. You know, I'm happy to have the question because I would not like anything that I've said to suggest otherwise. You know, the white supremacy, not white nationalism
Right.
so much, or let me make the distinction what nationalism is as opposed to white supremacy. White nationalism, especially in its current incarnation, is the idea that um, the white privilege has been taken away. That let me find you. I have a good quote from uh, Richard Spencer that um, white dispossession is so real, it's so obvious, it's just something one can't ignore, that a reaction had to occur, and it was only a question of when or how. It wasn't a question of whether. So, what this argument, and it's felt, you know, I'm not justifying it in any way, shape, or form, but this is the feeling that moves white nationalists, is that, to put it this way, they've always had a seat at the table, and suddenly there are these others whose values they don't respect and who they think don't respect their values, who are displacing them.
And do you think that's in some way different from white supremacist thinking?
Yes, white supremacy not this is a function of the age of mass immigration, or the perception of mass immigration, that it's about, I mean, the um, uh, the 2016 election was about Latinos, was about immigrants. Trump was going to build a wall. Um, you know, the illiberal regimes throughout Europe, their strength comes from movements about migrants. So it's about, you know, it doesn't deny or say otherwise distinction. I'm making a distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism. And white nationalism, there is this notion, a theory, it's called replacement theory, which is actually an import from France. And France on the right has been talking about le grand remplacement since the 1970s. And what it means is not only are real French being displaced by people from Africa and Muslims and so forth, but there are conspiracies at work to make that happen. And so, if you remember the Charlottesville, the chant in Charlottesville, you will not replace us. It is that which is at the heart of contemporary white
And if I
nationalism.
understand, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but what you're saying in a certain sense, I think, is white supremacy, in my mind, has been born of the experience of slavery in America. And it's the hatred of and the feeling that I must be superior and I am superior to Black Americans. White nationalism, it seems to me, is addressed to brown, to people who are coming across the borders, who are coming from the South and are brown, or are coming from far East and are called yellow. And so you have,
It could be that this movement could be based around um, opposition to immigration, which was the explicit message of the Trump campaign.
Mhm.
But what it also did was, when you define the immigrants as essentially the other, okay, what has happened is that othering has expanded. And so whiteness becomes kind of the most capacious of these categories. It's the thing that allows the greatest number of white people to identify with it, and on the other hand, puts Black people and brown people and Jewish people in the category, in the
well, and
same
now we
cat
have a
as
substantial Asian community also.
an Asian community who is not as poorly
Yeah.
regarded.
Okay. Let me go to another question, something you touched on. My non-academic relatives are getting messages via Facebook and other social media that insist that Nancy Pelosi and the mainstream media are preventing us from knowing all of the marvelous thing that Donald Trump is accomplishing for us, with lists of great achievements, search into lupus. How can we know what messages are being targeted at audience that we don't see or belong to?
We don't. The problem is we don't. And that's what I was referring to earlier as, it, if on the surface or the analytical surface, negative partisanship makes the prospective 2020 election look good for Blue America, the problem is we don't know what these messages and what these news stories, real fake news stories, are conveying to this highly targeted Facebook
Well, so here's,
population. So we don't know, and that's what puts this election in it's the big question in this election,
so
in
Larry,
my view.
we haven't talked about, but I'd appreciate if you touch on the role of the internet. I'm at the point where I feel like I'm not so sure this is a net benefit to have the internet. It's marvelous because you and I can talk and a lot of people can join in the conversation. And it seems to me that if you took away Twitter, and you wouldn't have Trump, and if you took away Facebook, you wouldn't have this massive support for Trump.
But there's no doubt that I would increase that by the how networked forces on the right are. The militia right were early adopters of all networking technology back in the 1980s, and they have stuck with it and stuck with it and stuck with it. I would say that Fox News
Mhm.
was an artifact of the coming of cable TV, and things like Breitbart are an artifact of the coming of the internet. And there's no doubt that the the right and these dark corners of the right thrive on it, and they not only thrive on it domestically. The connectivity internationally among these groups is extraordinary. The Nationalist International is very heavily networked.
Mhm.
Whether the internet is a final plus or a final negative is, at this point, maybe a theological question.
Good enough. Here's a question, something we didn't touch on, but it is important. The person says, isn't Mitch McConnell and wing in Congress representative of an additional faction of the far right, one that is also using Trump to further their agenda? And then are there parallels in fascist Italy or Weimar Germany?
Well, if you take what you can call the conservative establishment in Italy and in Germany, they both made a bet. And their bet was, okay, these guys are going to get rid of our opposition, the socialists and the communists, and they're going to do a good job out of it, and we'll be able to control them. They thought they could ride the tiger. Instead, they got eaten by the tiger.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is a kind of parallel there. There's a real question about the Republican Party's acquiescence, its massive acquiescence to Trumpism, such that, Mitt Romney is now heroically standing out for
Right.
the occasional misstep. And there were steps along the way. The first one was, well, so many of them moved from never Trumpers. The poster boy in all this is Lindsey Graham, but
Mm-hmm.
they were never Trumpers. And then, well, he's going to sign our bills. That's step one. And then step two is, oh my Lord, our constituency has turned Trumpian. If we are going to not be primaried out of office, we have to placate the now Trumpian voting base, populist voting base of the Republican Party. And then finally, I call this Sociology 101 role theory. And if you read role theory, that if you take on a role often enough, you become it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to a large extent, people like Lindsey Graham, that's what's happened to them. They've become that.
Got it. Got
And
it.
what will cure their fever? I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Let me move to another question. To what extent is there penetration of your dramatis personae in the military and or the police?
Oh, I think it's considerable. I think that what we're seeing in terms of the police kind of speaks for itself. We have uh, the head of the union of the Minneapolis police force, who has been lauded by and lauds Trump, utterly opposed to um, uh, any kind of sanction against Chauvin and his collaborators.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that is representative not only of individuals within police forces, but organized police force. And I imagine that inside those police forces, that that it would probably be extremely difficult to counter that ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I would distinguish between the effect of the professional, kind of managing class of the police, and
Rank and file.
the managing class of the military.
Oh, okay.
The military managing class the
Hmm.
officers,
Hmm.
the Mattises, the
Yeah,
Kellys, and so forth, um, you know, who have been, and they've been consistent throughout the Trump period. There was a strong sense of we're going to be in his cabinet to keep things on the straight and narrow to whatever extent we can. And that's like trying to fill a glass of water with a fire hose. You couldn't do
hmm,
it. But insofar as they represent the professional class of the military, um, they are not, or they remain an obstacle.
got it,
Uh,
got it. Other question. What do you make of the latest beef between Trump and the Pope? Any impact in the USA?
um, that's a good question, since American Catholics have a kind of emotional bond on each side of this. Uh,
Hmm.
you know, American Catholics are not as fond of Francis as they were uh, of John Paul the second, the Polish Pope,
Hmm.
who was a Cold Warrior, and Francis is kind of a liberal. He's he's uh,
Hmm.
he's
Hmm.
he's uh, outspoken, trying to change the church. He's running into a great deal of opposition, and so Catholics do have a kind of, I want to very, very strongly avoid the term dual loyalty. I do not mean dual loyalty, but they are pulled in two different directions. And it will be interesting the extent to which the American clergy um, becomes more Francis friendly
Hmm.
over,
Hmm.
over the succeeding months.
Got it. Here's one about the Boogaloo boys. What would they hope to establish if they get and win their civil war? What would their new government and society look like?
That's the thing. That's one of the important distinctions between them and the white nationalists. The white nationalists have this idea of the ethno state, the pure white ethno state. So there is where you land up. The thing about the accelerationists is they have kind of given up on an ideal, on what they're aiming for. It is the bring it down on its own terms. It's we'll figure it out later,
Got
and
it.
that's the essence of accelerationism, which has become a force in that world in the past few years. So they don't have one.
Got it. Got it. Another question, something we haven't explored at all that I think is important. Can you please discuss business interests for and against the far right? DeVos family funded the anti-lockdown protests. Are similar family foundations funding anti-BLM protests? Would some of these families be scared if the far right and Trump went in a more clearly fascist direction?
That's a good
Corporate
question.
America, Trump, far right.
You know, if you take something like the Koch brothers or the remaining Koch brother, um, they are not ideologically in step with Trump. They will um, uh, support him in things like the tax cuts, but they're appalled by the alienation of foreign allies. They're appalled by what he's done to trade agreements. They're appalled by the immigration stuff, recognizing the importance of immigrant labor in America. So, there is no simple correspondence between Trumpism and big capital in this country.
And Larry, I think the person was conflating two things that we may want to separate. One, you're talking about big capital corporate America, business America.
Ah,
This person's also talking about family foundations, the Scaife of the world, the Singers, the Sheldon Adelsons, etc.
that's why I focus
You were right to do that.
on the Kochs. Um, but, you know, to the extent to which, the Scaife family was very, very much a supporter of Republican orthodoxy over the past. They took an extreme view of it, but they were supporters of it. Um, you know, to a large extent, like the Republican Party, those family foundations have become Trumpians, and in whether they revert back, they've always been like the Scaifes and the DeVos family. They've always been more radical than Republican orthodoxy.
Right.
The same is true of the Koch brothers. And those radical points of view have been really susceptible to turning in a Trumpian direction. And so that has been the case, as you can see with the DeVos family.
Sometimes, Larry, I wonder if corporate capital needs an active, growing, healthy economy, whereas the family foundation just have piles and piles of money they want to do. So they just want an absence of regulation, absence of tax, leave me alone and let filthy rich, versus corporations that actually need an active government to support them, to fund them, and to give them all the help that the Fed and the Treasury and so on give them on a daily basis.
There's a parallel there. If you think about what Donald Trump represented as a businessman, he represented kind of familial business.
Right.
He did not have a board of directors. It was a closed shop.
Right.
In which the kinds of things that he apparently did, both in terms of, the kind of, blowing off contractors and not paying them. This is a man who has had 4,500 lawsuits around his business practices.
And he's bankrupted one after another of his businesses.
So that's a very different business formation than people who work in public corporations. So there is a really different formation. There was a wonderful article in anticipation of Trump's presidency when he first, in late 2015 by a sociologist called Gary Marks. And basically it made this amazing parallel to Tony Soprano. Which, as time went on, you got this guy's a rat, this is a stand-up guy around Michael Cohen versus God, who was it? Flynn, I think it was, maybe that. But no, it was Manafort. That kind of thing, or the very, plot, as it were, against the Ukrainians. We'd like you to do us a favor.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I have friends who just call them Mafia Don.
Yeah. So that's
an insult to the mafia, but
that's it's a different economic universe with different norms, different values, and different ways of operation.
Right.
And they're dark, they're closed. So it's and the Koch brothers, of course, are privately held as well.
Here's an interesting one. Going back to the fringe. I watched closely the live streams from pro-Trump demonstrations, including the Battle of Berkeley, Charlottesville, and Portland, where a lot of the guys in Portland in particular seemed like wannabes, out of shape, middle-aged guys in armor who are not likely to be very useful in, quote, battle. For how many of the militia types is this really, though they won't admit it, sort of a game? They can posture and shout, but they don't really expect to be called upon to fight.
It's a great question. I would say that to the extent to which we have any evidence of that, they have the rising of the patriots has never happened, and there have been considerable provocations. Timothy McVeigh was such a provocation. Dylan Roof was such a provocation. And you can go on and on and on. And so the fantasy, and I use the word advisedly, that the patriots would rise up and there would be the coming of the Civil War, which is a
Hmm.
notion that has been with the militia right since the 1970s, since the publication of a book called The Turner Diaries, which
Hmm.
outlined that and to an apocalyptic end. Um, but to the extent to which we know an answer to that, um, it hasn't happened.
Okay. Someone asks about, I think you could call it geography of the far right. Are there certain states where they hang out? Are there states where they're more concentrated or less concentrated?
Well, famously, there are certain states where they are heavily concentrated, above all, Idaho. And when they talk about a uh, an ethno state, that's the general area. Of course, there's Northern California, which has had the quote unquote state of Jefferson, which takes in parts of as well of Idaho and Oregon, um, which has gone on, for a very long time. What's really interesting about the Trump constituency, in my view, is that the the most the best predictor of who would be a Trump voter was not the presence of immigrants in their midst, but the absence. So people tended,
Mm.
in my book, I call this the imaginary other, that the imaginary other was far more threatening and far more effective politically than actually living among immigrants. So the Trump constituency is interestingly very well, or perhaps in its best explanation in terms of geographic dispersal, is notable for living in places in zip codes where you don't find immigrants.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. There are a whole series of questions, Larry, that are asking you to crystal ball. So I'll throw them at you, but it may be just beyond the abilities of your crystal ball today. One says, what if he loses the election and refuses to leave office? What if it's very close and he refuses to leave office? If he were to lose, what might these groups do if he were to lose? Questions about basically what happens if the election either comes apart at the seams, doesn't go well, or is a real mess.
Okay. Again, we have history, which says that they don't rise up when when the patriots, quote unquote, don't really rise up.
Mhm.
Maybe it's different now. Uh, One of the things that I think could make it different, and this has always been there in you know, the Trump kind of catalog of what he might do, is war. Um, you know,
Wag the dog?
yes, that would be an event which could lead to the kind of emergency situation that would at once affect institutions and at the same time actually motivate the militias to move.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
so that actually is for me my biggest worry is and if you think about, to use the not the metaphor but the example of the rise of fascism before World War One, you didn't have fascism. You did have nationalism. You had nationalism, which isn't all that different from the nationalism we have today. In fact, it's kind of the forerunner of the nationalism we have today. But you get, after the war, fascism. You get that because you have a a body of people who have been to war and whose idea and who have come from, these are people from the countryside, and this is their major exposure to the nation, and their learning curve is war. Okay, and so that was very functional for the rise of fascism. Fascism is formed in March of 1919, first meeting that calls itself fascism.
Mm-hmm.
It comes to power in Italy in November of 22. That's less than a US presidential term.
Yeah.
Okay. So the biggest worry about going from where we are and the kind of illiberalism which on the one hand Trump is attempting to institute, and on the other hand which our institutions have resisted, the biggest threat to that, it seems to me, is going to war.
Larry, that might be the darkest but most appropriate moment to close. We have passed the 5 o'clock hour. It's been fascinating talking with you. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I can tell by the number of people who are still here that people have found it as fascinating as I have. So I want to thank you very, very much for joining OLLI and being willing to spend this time with us, parsing, slicing, and dicing what the far right is. And I want to remind people one more time: Empire of Resentment, Populism's Toxic Embrace of Nationalism, out in the fall, right?
Out there, actually, the end of the summer, September 8th.
Okay, very good. It'll be there. Any last words of wisdom, terror, or fear? Or let's make it hope. Words of hope.
Words of hope are we still have elections in this country, and love me, lovely. I'm a liberal. This is the mechanism, par excellence, or coming out of what did Gerald Ford call it? Our long national nightmare.
Yes.
This is the root out of our
Okay,
long.
there it is, folks. November is when it happens. Let me thank all of you who have joined us. Let me thank OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which will be offering many more discussions like this about America's unfinished business. And I, Bill Sokol, personally thank Larry Rosenthal because it's been just wonderful, Larry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and let me thank OLLI. And I understand there are people out there who are viewing this and have listened to this, and while you are all faceless, thank you for being here.
There you go. Good night. I think we've taken you through the nap hour. On to cocktail time.
Thank you very much.
Take care, Larry.